The digital numbers on the microwave pulsed a steady neon 1:15 a.m. Imani Rivers stood alone in the suffocating stillness of the wood-paneled study. The only light in the sprawling penthouse came from the electric glow of the Manhattan skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the mahogany floor. 60 floors below, New York City vibrated with a life she barely touched, a world of subway whistles and late-night street vendors. But up here, the silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight against her chest. Imani knelt on the plush rug, her small flashlight cutting a frantic, singular path through the darkness toward the open-wall safe. Yellow taxis moved through the grid below like distant embers, carrying people to safe, ordinary lives. But inside this room, the air had turned lethal. Imani's heart hammered against her ribs as the flashlight beam landed on stacks of $100 bills, their edges soaked in a dark, crimson residue that hadn't yet dried. She pulled her phone from her pocket, its screen a blinding white glare in the gloom, reflecting off the blood-stained wealth of a man who ruled this city from the shadows. Miles away, in the back of a black sedan, Choi Tae-won sat with his elbows on his knees, staring into the dark. He wore a black dress shirt buttoned to the chin, his sharp jawline tight with a tension that never left him. He checked his phone for the 5th time in 10 minutes, not for a business deal, but for a message he didn't even know he was waiting for. He took a slow breath, the city lights flickering across his stoic face like a silent tally of his own survival. Suddenly, the device vibrated. His dark eyes locked onto the screen, reading the frantic, misplaced words of the girl who cleaned his floors. He didn't delete it. He didn't call his cleaners to handle her. Instead, his thumb hovered over the glass, his expression shifting from cold calculation to a dangerous, newfound obsession. Back in the study, a sudden ping shattered the silence. Imani's breath hitched as she looked at the reply from the one man she was never supposed to contact. The 3 words on the screen felt like a physical restraint, pinning Imani to the spot. Her thumb hovered over the power button, her mind racing through the logistics of flight. If she ran now, she could be out the service entrance in 3 minutes, but 60 floors was a long way down for someone who was already a marked woman. She had been in this penthouse for 3 months, lured by the siren call of an $8,000 monthly salary to scrub the floors of Victor Langford's ivory tower. It was a king's ransom for a girl from the South Side, but every cent was spoken for before it even hit her account. It was the price of Marcus's life, the chemo, the hospital stays, and the fragile hope that his leukemia might finally retreat. The silence of the study was shattered by the soft, mechanical chime of the private elevator. Imani's breath hitched, the flashlight trembling in her grip as the heavy doors slid open. 2 figures stepped into the dim light. The first was a mountain of a man, Kim Hyun-woo, whose eyes scanned the room with a quiet, dangerous temper. But it was the man behind him who commanded the air. Choi Tae-won was unexpectedly young, perhaps in his early 30s, with sharp, sculpted features that looked like they had been carved from cold marble. Dressed in an all-black suit that absorbed the faint light of the room, he moved with a predatory grace that made the hum of the vacuum sound like a scream. He didn't look at Imani first. Instead, he walked toward the open safe, his presence unnervingly calm. He peered into the dark cavity, his gaze lingering on the crimson-stained currency before he turned to Imani. He held out a gloved hand for her phone. With shaking fingers, she surrendered it. He scrolled through the photos she had taken the evidence of her discovery and then looked back at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Tell me exactly what you saw and when," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. I was just cleaning," Imani whispered, her honesty, her only shield. "The safe was ajar. I saw the money, saw the blood. I panicked. I meant to text Tasha. I didn't mean to send it to you." Taewon's jaw tightened as he looked back at the safe. "Victor works for me. This money should have been cleaned weeks ago. The blood is problematic." The room seemed to tilt. Victor wasn't the man at the top. He was just another cog in Taewon's machine. The power dynamic shifted, leaving Imani standing before the true architect of the shadows. She expected a threat, a demand for silence, or worse. Instead, Taewon stepped closer, the smell of expensive cologne and cold air clinging to him. "You took photos to protect yourself, yet you're still here," he noted, his voice carrying a vibration that sounded almost like curiosity. He looked at her worn sweatshirt and then at the terror in her eyes. "What do you need, Imani?" Taewon's question hung in the air, a tether thrown to a drowning woman. He stepped away from the safe, his movements fluid and precise, as he began to pace the length of the wood-paneled study. Victor, he explained with a chilling detachment, had been skimming from the syndicate for months, and the organization now suspected he was seeking leverage through FBI involvement. The crimson staining the cash was the residue of a territorial dispute that had spiraled out of control. A rival family eliminated in a night of violence Victor was supposed to scrub from the ledgers. Instead, he had hoarded the evidence, a betrayal that Taewon's organization needed to document with absolute proof. Stopping his pace, Taewon turned his intense, calculating gaze back toward Imani, studying her with a clinical focus that seemed to peel back her skin. "You need money," he stated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. "I can see the weight of it." "Medical bills?" The breath left Imani's lungs in a ragged huff. The truth tumbled out before her fear could catch it. Marcus, the sterile scent of the oncology ward, and the $200,000 debt that grew like a parasite with every passing hour. The offer followed with the cold logic of a business transaction. If Imani gathered the necessary evidence of Victor's betrayal from within the penthouse, Taewon would pay for Marcus's full treatment. But the weight of the stakes was clear. Should she refuse, she would remain a liability who knew too much to be left to the city streets. Imani's mind flashed to Marcus, pale and fighting for every breath in his hospital bed. It was an impossible choice, a deal signed in the very blood she had just discovered. "I'll do it," she whispered, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "But I want the first payment immediately." A mirthless, slight smile crossed Taewon's lips, his sharp features softening with a flicker of something that wasn't quite cruelty. "I already made it," he countered calmly. "Check your account." With trembling hands, Imani pulled her phone back out. A notification sat at the top of the screen. A $25,000 deposit, cleared 10 minutes ago, long before she had even uttered her consent. The man standing before her hadn't waited for her permission. He had gambled on her desperation. "I replied to your text instead of deleting it," Taewon said, looking down at his own device as he prepared to leave. "That's the kind of impulse that makes you dangerous or useful. Let's find out which." The hum of the elevator faded, leaving Imani alone in the heavy, expensive silence of the study. Her mind, however, was miles and years away, anchored in the humidity of Atlanta. She could almost smell the antiseptic scent of the free clinic where her mother, Teresa, had spent her final hours. Teresa had been a woman of iron will, who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, only to be taken at 49 by diabetes complications that a simple bottle of insulin and a decent insurance plan could have prevented. Her death had left Imani as the sole guardian of 12-year-old Marcus, a responsibility she wore like a second skin while she white-knuckled her way through community college. Then came the second blow, Marcus's diagnosis. Leukemia was a hungry beast, and at 15, his life had become a series of crushing medical bills that no scholarship or part-time waitressing job could cover. Desperation had driven her to New York, to a high-paying listing that felt too good to be true. She had seen the red flags from the very first interview, the odd hours, the layers of biometric security, and the strictly cash-only payments. But when the choice is between a shady employer and a brother's casket, the decision isn't a choice at all. Don't enter rooms that are locked. Ever. Victor had told her on her first day, his professionalism as cold and sterile as a surgical blade. For 3 months, Imani had perfected the art of being a ghost. She cleaned, she cooked, and she watched the world from the periphery, asking no questions and offering no opinions. Every cent she didn't spend on subway fare was wired back to Atlanta, to Tasha, her childhood best friend who was now Marcus's surrogate mother and Imani's only link to home. Tasha was the one who kept her grounded, the one who reminded her that this life was temporary, just a means to an end. Retreating to her cramped staff room tucked behind the kitchen, Imani sank onto the narrow cot. The adrenaline was finally ebbing, replaced by a cold, hollow realization. Her phone buzzed against her palm. It wasn't Tasha. Tomorrow, photograph any documents in his office. I'll text when he leaves. Taewon's message was a direct order, a tether pulling her deeper into the dark. She looked at the lock screen of her phone, a photo of Marcus, grinning despite his hospital gown, his eyes still bright with a future she was determined to buy. She had spent her entire life trying to be invisible, believing that if she just worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough, the world would let her pass through unscathed. But as she stared at the glowing text, she realized that version of herself was dead. By discovering the blood in the safe and engaging with the man who owned the shadows, she was no longer just a maid. She was no longer invisible. She was dangerous. The next 2 weeks were a blur of calculated risks and quiet thievery. Imani moved through the penthouse like a shadow within a shadow, her smartphone becoming a weapon of record. She learned the rhythmic clicks of the safe, the weight of the ledgers, and the exact frequency of Victor's heavy footsteps. She spent her nights recording muffled conversations through vents and her days photographing encrypted files, all while Victor's paranoia began to rot the air around them. He paced the halls more frequently, his eyes darting to every corner, often stopping to question why her vacuum hummed later than usual. "Just being thorough, sir," she would say, her voice as steady as her hands were shaking. The dust in the vents is persistent. As the external danger scaled, the frequency of the pings on her private phone changed. Taewon's messages were no longer just cold directives. They began to bleed into the spaces of her life she thought he'd never care to notice. "Did you eat today?" he would ask, or simply, "Are you safe?" These brief, quiet exchanges felt like a tether in a storm, a strange, flickering intimacy with a man who dealt in darkness. The opportunity finally broke when Victor left for an unscheduled business meeting. Imani didn't waste a heartbeat. She slipped into his forbidden office, the air smelling of stale cigar smoke and panic. Inside a locked mahogany drawer, she found the Holy Grail, a secondary set of ledgers detailing a systematic $4.7 million embezzlement spanning 2 years. Tucked between the pages were handwritten notes, scrawled FBI case numbers and names of agents. She photographed every page, her breath hitching as the images uploaded to Taewon. His response was immediate. "Meet me tomorrow. In person. We need to talk." Before she could process the weight of a physical meeting, Tasha's name flashed on the screen. The call from Atlanta was full of tearful relief. Marcus's scans were finally improving, and the new aggressive treatment was working miracles. But Tasha's joy was tempered by a sharp, intuitive edge. "How are you really paying for this, Imani? A maid's salary doesn't cover experimental oncology." "I got a raise, Tasha." Imani lied, her heart aching at the distance the words created. Victor is generous when the work is done right. She hung up just as the heavy thud of the front door echoed through the hall. Imani scrambled out of the office, her heart slamming against her ribs as she collided with the heavy silence of the corridor. Victor stood there, his coat still on, his gaze sharp enough to draw blood. "Working late again, Miss Rivers?" he asked, his eyes traveling from the office door to her empty hands. The heat of the phone in her pocket felt like a brand. "Just finished the kitchen, sir," she managed, forcing a tired smile. Victor stared at her for a long, agonizing beat. the suspicion in his eyes a living thing. Then, he nodded slowly. Good. Lock up when you leave. He walked past her, but the chill he left behind told Imani that the invisibility she once relied on was officially dead. The following afternoon, Flushing was a blur of neon signs and the sharp scent of roasted spices. Imani found the restaurant tucked away in a quiet alley, its unassuming exterior a perfect shroud for the man waiting inside. Kim Hyun-woo stood like a sentinel outside a heavy oak door at the back, his silent nod the only permission she needed to enter. Taewon was seated at a low table, the glow of a single overhead lamp sharpening the angles of his face. He didn't look like a mob boss here. He looked like a man weighed down by the very world he ruled. He spent several minutes scrolling through the photos on Imani's phone, his jaw tightening as the extent of Victor's treachery became clear. "This is perfect," he murmured, sliding the device back toward her. "He hasn't just been stealing, he's been building a bridge to the FBI. He's trying to trade my head for his freedom." Taewon leaned back, his eyes catching the light. He explained his intent to expose Victor to the board of the syndicate, a move designed to strip him of power without a single bullet being fired. "I don't want more blood, Imani. My father built this empire on it, but I am trying to build something that can survive in the light. You don't seem like what I expected," Imani admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The monster she had imagined didn't speak of legacy and restraint. Taewon offered a weary, rare smile. He spoke of inheriting the organization at 25 after his father's violent passing, thrust into a war he hadn't asked for. Victor was supposed to be the legitimate architect to help him transition, a hope that had clearly curdled into greed. As he spoke, his gaze drifted to Imani's hand, resting on the table. "That scar," he noted, gesturing to the jagged mark across her knuckles. "How did it happen?" "A childhood accident," she said, tracing the pale line. "My mother couldn't afford the ER. We sat in a free clinic for 6 hours before anyone even looked at it." She looked up, her eyes fierce. "It's a reminder that in this world, if you don't have the money to fix things, they stay broken. That's why I won't let Marcus stay broken." Taewon watched her, a profound shift occurring in the silence between them. "I understand," he said softly. "My mother has early onset Alzheimer's. I visit her every Sunday in a private care ward. Most days, she looks right through me like I'm a stranger." In that moment, the $20 million penthouse and the blood-stained ledgers vanished. They were simply two people, bound by the crushing weight of caregiving and the desperate lengths they would go to for the people they loved. The air in the room grew thick, with a sudden, mutual recognition, a bridge built over shared grief. The door creaked open as Kim stepped in, his voice cutting through the intimacy. "We need to leave." Victor just left the penthouse. Taewon rose, his stoic mask sliding back into place. He handed Imani a sleek, encrypted smartphone. "Use this only for me. Your other phone is no longer secure." As their fingers brushed over the device, the connection remained. A silent vow that they were no longer just a boss and a maid, but two survivors navigating the same storm. The warmth of the tea from Flushing had barely left Imani's chest before the air in the penthouse soured. She didn't know that while she was tracing the scars of her past for Taewon, Victor was watching her through the unblinking eyes of hidden cameras he'd installed in the vents. He had seen it all, the flash of her phone, the careful leafing through his private ledgers, and the quiet defiance in her posture. But Victor was not a man of impulsive rage. He was a man of calculated leverage. He didn't confront her. Instead, he invited her into his study the next evening, the room dim and smelling of expensive leather and deception. On his desk lay a series of crime scene photographs, vivid, harrowing images of the family killed in the territorial dispute. The blood on the money she had found wasn't just an abstract concept anymore. It had faces. It had a home. "This is who you're truly working for, Miss Rivers," Victor said, his voice a low, sympathetic purr. Tae-won ordered these deaths. He doesn't build things, he dismantles them. Before Imani could find her voice, he slid a tablet across the desk. Her heart plummeted as she read the forged text messages. Tae-won's name at the top, followed by a chilling order to handle the girl once the leak is plugged. Then came the audio, a synthesized, gravelly recording of Tae-won's voice, uttering the sentence that froze the marrow in her bones. She's seen too much. Make sure she doesn't leave the penthouse. The evidence was a physical blow, staggering in its completeness. It mirrored every nightmare she had ever had about the men who operated outside the law. Victor leaned in, his eyes wide with a manufactured concern. The FBI is already moving in. I've made a deal, and I can include you. Testify against him. Get immunity. Federal protection for you and Marcus. His treatment will continue, Imani. You don't have to die for a man who views you as a disposable tool. Shaken to her core, Imani retreated to her room, the walls closing in. The memory of Tae-won's gaze in the restaurant, the shared vulnerability over their mothers, felt like a beautiful lie designed to keep her compliant. She called Tasha, her voice thick with a panic she could no longer suppress. "Oh God, Imani," Tasha whispered after hearing the details. "You need to run. Right now. These people don't let witnesses live. They don't give second chances. Think about Marcus. He needs you alive, not a martyr." Imani sat on her cot, caught in a devastating rift between the man she thought she had glimpsed and the monster the evidence screamed he was. The trust they had begun to weave felt like a noose. Victor's final warning echoed in the silence of the room. "The FBI needs your answer by tomorrow night. Think about Marcus." For the first time, the penthouse didn't feel like a job or even a hiding place. It was a cage, and the lock was turning. The warehouse on the edge of the East River was a hollowed-out rib cage of rusted steel and salt-crusted concrete. Imani arrived first, the wire beneath her olive-green shirt itching against her skin like a guilty conscience. Victor had promised her that the FBI was listening, that this was the moment she secured Marcus's life. But as the heavy steel door groaned shut behind Tae-won minutes later, the silence that followed didn't feel like protection. It felt like a tomb. Tae-won walked into the center of the bay, his black suit making him a shadow against the gray afternoon light. He stopped when he saw Imani, his expression flickering with a devastating flash of betrayal before he turned to Victor, who stood on a raised platform flanked by men in suits Victor claimed were federal agents, though their eyes held the cold, hollow greed of mercenaries. "I'm impressed you both came," Victor said, his voice echoing off the corrugated walls. "Makes this so much cleaner." A domestic dispute turned fatal, a crime boss and his treacherous maid. The FBI gets their caller, and I get my exit. The facade of the businessman stripped away, revealing a man who had spent years feeding like a parasite on the syndicate. Victor stepped down, gesturing toward an open laptop on a crate. "You handed me the keys, kid." He sneered at Tae-won. "Did you think I'd just be grateful while you tried to go legitimate and cut my margins? I've been skimming since the day your father died." He turned his predatory grin toward Imani. "And you, so eager to believe the worst. The FBI doesn't know any of the evidence is fake. Those texts showing he'd kill you, I made them." The audio? A few minutes of AI software. Imani's gaze darted to the screen as Victor scrolled through his files, mocking their trust. Her breath caught. There, in a folder marked internal, were the real intercepts. She saw a message Tae-won had sent to Kim Hyun-woo just 2 nights ago. "Protect the girl. She matters. Even if I don't survive this, Marcus's bills are to be paid in full." The world tilted back onto its axis. The forged messages, the fear, the doubt, it was all a cage Victor had built to keep her from seeing the man standing in front of her. Imani looked at Tae-won, her eyes stinging with a sudden, fierce clarity. Tae-won didn't look at Victor. He looked only at her. "I told you I was trying to build something different," he said, his voice rough but unwavering. "I would never hurt you, Imani. The wrong text you sent. It didn't just save my organization. It saved me from the person I was becoming." Victor threw his head back and laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. How touching. The immigrant boss and the desperate maid. A match made in the gutter. "Make sure this is in my memoir." He raised his weapon, the barrel leveled at the space between them. But memoirs are better with a tragic ending. The click of the safety was the loudest sound in the world. Imani didn't flinch. For the first time since opening the safe, she wasn't afraid of the dark. She was finally standing in the light. The metal of Victor's gun caught the light one last time as his finger began to squeeze. But before the hammer could fall, a single deafening crack tore through the warehouse rafters. Victor's scream followed a beat later as he spun backward, his weapon clattering to the concrete. From the dense shadows behind a stack of rusted shipping crates, Kim Hyun-woo emerged. He moved with the practiced stillness of a ghost, his own handgun leveled with terrifying precision. "I knew you'd betray us," Kim said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through Victor's whimpering. "I've been waiting for you to trip over your own greed." The warehouse exploded into a cacophony of shouting and heavy footfalls. The men Victor had introduced as federal agents, the mercenaries on his secret payroll, scrambled for cover, returning fire as the real perimeter was breached. Blue and red lights began to strobe against the high, cracked windows. "Tunnel, southeast corner, now!" Kim roared over the gunfire. He didn't just point, he moved, a wall of muscle and loyalty shielding them from the fray. Taewon lunged toward Imani, his hand outstretched, but he hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes searching hers for fear or flight. Imani didn't hesitate. She reached out and gripped his hand, her fingers locking with his. "You told me to stay put," she shouted over the rising sirens. "I'm not moving. We run together or not at all." They sprinted. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, burnt powder, and old river salt. Behind them, Kim stood his ground, a lone sentinel holding back the breach as they dove into the darkness of the southeast corner. They descended a narrow, iron-rung ladder into a claustrophobic throat of brick and mud, an old Prohibition-era smuggling tunnel that smelled of a century's worth of damp secrets. The descent was a blur of flickering, low-voltage emergency lights and the splashing of stagnant water against their boots. Above them, Victor's voice echoed down the shaft, distorted by rage and pain. "They're escaping! Lock down the perimeter!" The tunnel felt endless, the ceiling pressing down until the brick gave way to a concrete foundation. With a final, desperate heave, Taewon shoved open a heavy wooden trapdoor. They scrambled up into the frantic, steam-filled kitchen of a Chinatown restaurant. Behind them, a muffled explosion vibrated through the floor, Kim's final gift, a structural collapse that buried the tunnel and silenced their pursuers. Confused cooks stared as the two of them emerged. Covered in grime and breathing hard, Taewon didn't miss a beat. He looked at the head chef and spoke in perfect, effortless Mandarin. "Sorry for the intrusion," he murmured, pulling a thick roll of cash from his pocket and dropping it onto the prep table. They burst through the back exit into the neon-soaked streets of Chinatown. The air was a chaotic symphony of sirens and shouting, the city closing in on the carnage they had left behind. Imani looked at the man beside her, his hand still anchored to hers. "Where do we go?" "Somewhere even I didn't know existed," Taewon replied, his gaze already scanning the crowd for a waiting car. "Kim planned for this. We're going off the grid." The safe house was a modest apartment in Queens, tucked away behind a laundromat and belonging to Kim's aunt. It was off every grid, a quiet sanctuary of lace doilies and the faint scent of sesame oil. While the world outside burned with news of Victor's arrest and the collapse of a corrupt federal task force, Taewon's organization worked in the shadows to contain the damage. The evidence Imani had gathered rendered Victor's FBI deal useless. He was a liability now, headed for a maximum security cell. A cryptic message from Kim had arrived shortly after they went dark. "Victor won't talk. He knows what happens if he does, but the cost was steep." Imani couldn't return to the visible world. She was a ghost wanted for questioning, trapped in a temporary limbo. That first night, as they sat in the dim living room, the weight of the silence finally broke. "I've been trying to undo my father's violence for 7 years," Taewon confessed, his voice rough and vulnerable in the small space. "Victor was supposed to be the architect of our legitimacy. Instead, he became the very rot I was trying to cut out." He looked at Imani, his dark eyes searching hers. "When I saw your text, I should have deleted it. I should have had you eliminated. But something in those words. You were so desperate and so honest. I hadn't felt that in years." "I thought you'd kill me," Imani whispered. Taewon offered a tired, genuine smile. "I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Then I replied. It was the first impulse decision I've made since the day my father died." 6 months later, the shadows had largely receded. Victor was serving 25 years, having turned on his handlers to save his own skin. Taewon had successfully pivoted his empire into legitimate real estate and global logistics, businesses that thrived in the light. Imani, no longer a maid or a ghost, served as his lead consultant, her sharp mind finally finding the high-stakes outlet it deserved. In Atlanta, Marcus was in full remission and preparing for college, his future secured by a man he had never met but who had saved his life. The final transformation took place in a sunlit care facility. Taewon's mother was having a rare, lucid day. Imani sat beside her, offering a tray of homemade bibimbap she had spent weeks learning to perfect. The older woman looked from the food to Imani, then at her son. "Is this the girl from your phone?" she asked in Korean. Imani caught the meaning and felt a flush of warmth. Taewon reached out, his hand covering Imani's on the table. "Yes, Ioma, she changed everything." His mother smiled softly. "Good. You needed changing." Imani's phone sat nearby, the screen displaying the message that had started it all. "I opened the safe. It's blood money." "Do you regret it?" Taewon asked, his thumb tracing the scar on her knuckles. "The wrong text?" Imani looked at their linked hands, both scarred by different pasts, both choosing a shared future. "Best mistake I ever made."